Corsair, Apple Floppy Days, Commodore, Tandy Floppy Days, Atari, TI Floppy Days. The weekend comes, the disk drive hums, ready to code for you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we played, you shared with me. Those days, Motorola, Intel 6502, graphics and text are there to view. Composite, color, or RGB, program fun for you and me.
Floppy Days is recorded in a live studio.
Inside PC Floppy Days, ST Amiga Floppy Days, Junior Sinclair Floppy Days, Classic Days, Microwaves, geeking all week with you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we played, you shared with me. Those days, these floppy days are yours and mine. These floppy days are yours and mine. Floppy days.
The TRS-80 Model 3.
Introducing the Apple IIc.
Atari 1040 ST. Commodore 64.
PC Junior, new from IBM.
Discover Atari.
At his Radio Shack Color Computer 3.
Introducing the Timex Sinclair 1000.
For computer, this is the one. Texas Instruments home computer.
A wonder computer of the 1980s. The Commodore VIC-20.
Hello and welcome to Floppy Days number 119 for October 2022. And I'm your host, Randy Kindig. I hope everyone's safe and sound. We're currently covering the very prolific year for home computers of 1982. This episode is the continuation of a multi-episode arc that covers the ZX Spectrum through all the usual topics. I don't even know yet how many episodes we're going to end up in this arc. There's so much to talk about and so many knowledgeable people on the subject that the Spectrum is probably going to set the Floppy Days record for the number of episodes about a single machine. This is the fourth of those, with the first having been the interview with John Grant of Nine Tiles, and the second and third being coverage of the history of the Spectrum with Alessandro Grussu. In this episode, I talk with the author of the wonderful book, The ZX Spectrum Ula, How to Design a Microcomputer, Mr. Chris Smith. I don't know of anyone who knows more about the internals of the Spectrum than Chris, as evidenced by his book, other than maybe the original designers. In this episode, I interview Chris about him, his book, his collection, and other topics. As usual, I will talk a bit about what I've been up to, including an update on the great barn find of 2022, attendance at a computer show, as well as a few new acquisitions beyond the barn find that have come my way. In addition, I'll briefly tell you about upcoming shows of which I'm aware. Finally, while I usually don't like to talk about monetary support for this podcast, I do want to mention I have a way for you to help if you have the inclination. I have a page set up at patreon.com/floppydays where you can donate. Any funds that you donate will be used to defray the cost of managing the podcast, as well as acquiring new hardware to talk about. Thank you so much to everyone who has contributed and continues to contribute.
Hi, I'm Chris Smith, author of the ZX Spectrum Ula, How to Design a Microcomputer, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer of Retro Games Limited, behind such products as the C64 Mini Full Size and the A500 Mini. This is the Floppy Days podcast.
Okay, now for a new few acquisitions and what I've been up to. First of all, I wanted to cover a few items that I've managed to acquire that were not a part of the great barn find of 2022. These are just things that I've acquired along the way during my typical acquisitions. First up is an Apple IIgs monitor connector for the Coco. It's a bit of an odd one. If you're like me, you've acquired a few specialized monitors along the way for specific machines. Although I really prefer to acquire video solutions for my machines that allow them to use modern or semi-modern LCD TVs and VGA or HDMI output, I do have a few monitors that were produced back in the day as a package with a specific machine or machines, and which are really kind of good to have to get that real back in the day look and feel, as well as typically producing very nice output. One of those common analog monitors is the RGB one that was produced for the Apple II GS. Now, often those monitors may work exclusively with a specific computer and may have a specific cable to support that machine. This is true of the Apple II GS RGB monitor. However, a gentleman by the name of Mike Rojas figured out how to hook the Coco 3 with its RGB output to the Apple II GS RGB monitor. Since I had the monitor and a Coco 3, and this device is so inexpensive, it certainly seemed like a great thing to acquire. Mike Rojas, again, is the one who built this. He was selling them through Facebook, or is selling them through Facebook. Mine actually was paid for by James Shackle, who's a friend of the show. I've actually met James a couple of times, and I'm going to talk about him a little bit because he was a little bit later, because he was actually at Tandy Assembly. But James was nice enough to tell me about this device and then go ahead and pay to have one shipped to me. The package includes an assembled PCB, a power supply, a 3D printed case, and a 10-pin ribbon cable, and it only sells for about $12 plus shipping, so it's really inexpensive. You can also actually do it yourself if you want to. There's a GitHub page on how to build it. So that's the first acquisition. Next up is an acquisition that I got, or acquisitions actually, for the Atari ST. As many of you know, the Atari ST was one of the machines I had back in the day. I really liked that machine, and I have a Mega ST today with plans to acquire a Mega STE, which is my dream machine, as soon as I can get one, or as soon as I can afford one. One of the best programming languages ever produced for that machine was something called GFA Basic. GFA Basic is a dialect of the basic programming language created by Frank Ostrowski. And the name is derived from the company who marketed it, GFA System Technic GmbH, which distributed that software. Before, now just as a side note, before Frank Ostrowski wrote GFA Basic, he created Turbo Basic XL for the Atari 8-bit machine, which is probably, outside of Atari Basic, the most commonly used BASIC on the Atari 8-bits. So seems like he was a pretty talented guy when it came to developing BASICs. The GFA Basic interpreter is compact, reasonably fast, was shipped with a runtime that could be freely distributed with your programs. There was a compiler that was made available also, so you could increase the execution speed even more, essentially doubling it. It was a very optimized language for execution speed, supported direct assembler level calls. You could embed sections of assembler code directly within the basic source code, and it integrated neatly into GEM and TOS, the Atari ST's operating system, and provided the ability to create menus, dialog boxes, and mouse control. So I've always had a fascination with this language, always wanted to acquire the software and manuals for my ST. Now recently, I came across some manuals on eBay that looked to be exactly what I wanted. They included the GFA Basic Training Reboot Camp, which is a beginning tutorial for the GFA Basic Interpreter. Another book called the GFA Basic Book, which says it's an intermediate programming tutorial for GFA Basic. And thirdly, a big binder that is entitled GFA Basic Atari Reference Manual. And it has different sections in it on the compiler, one on the compiler and one on the interpreter. So there's a lot there I need to go through. I'm really happy that I was able to acquire these manuals for GFA Basic, and hope to get a chance to really dig in to GFA Basic on the ST. All right, beyond acquisitions, I want to talk about a couple of other things that I've been up to. I want to give an update on the great barn find of 2022. I continue to work and clean up, test, and document approximately 45 computers and half a dozen monitors that were included in the barn find. It's really a long, laborious process. I've been putting the machines into one of 4 different piles, depending on the results of the testing. Either I've got a pile for fully working machines, I've got a pile for machines that are mostly working but have some sort of issue that can probably be easily fixed. I've got a pile for non-working machines that just simply don't turn on. And I've got machines that haven't yet been tested, of course. So those are the 4 different piles I'm working off of. I would guess about 75% or so of the machines fully work or work with some sort of issue, which isn't too bad for machines that have been sitting in a barn for 20 years. I certainly will have some project work for some time, as if I didn't already have a pretty long list. I still haven't even gotten to some of the more valuable and less common machines to test and clean up, such as the IBM PC5140 portable and the 2 Amiga 1000s that are in that group of things. My main goal is to get all of the computers, so I'm not worried about, at the moment, the software, books, magazines, cords, manuals, that sort of thing. But I want to get all of the computers, all the electronics inside my home before the freezing temperatures set in. I think these machines have been through enough trauma, and I don't want them to be out in an uncontrolled environment any longer. I'm almost there with less than 10 machines and our monitors to clean up, at least superficially, and bring inside. I've been posting some of the machines to the local Indie Vintage Computer Club group to gauge their interest in acquiring them before I look to sell some of them on Amazon Marketplace and or eBay, at least for those items that I'm not going to keep. Finally, I did attend another computer show since the last episode as well. This one was Tandy Assembly, and it occurred in Springfield, Ohio. While not nearly as large or grand as VCF Midwest in Chicago was, it's always a fun show. It was better attended than last year. Last year, COVID kind of reduced its size, but this year was a little larger and had a great set of exhibits. I used to participate in the planning of the event, but had to give that up a couple years ago due to time constraints. However, as the planning committee was short-handed due to restrictions at the Canadian border and other reasons, I helped out with the always popular auction, which was a lot of fun, and to which I donated a couple of Tandy barn find items. I also did have an exhibit again at the show. The main focus of my table was promotion of the Floppy Days podcast, but I also took my Tandy MC10 with modern upgrades, the MCX32 SD, which I mentioned on the show once, and had it on display. I also took the barn find diskless TRS-80 Model 3 with me, which was untested at the time due to a mouse having chewed off the power cord. Ian Maverick was nice enough to convert it to a standard 3-prong connector using a kit from Jay Neuwirth, and was able to turn it on and prove that it works. He also put on a new power switch and told me how to fix the keyboard issues with the machine, as it has a few keys that don't work. All in all, I was very pleased with the outcome with that machine. It was great to see some friends at the show, which I usually only see once a year, such as Ian Maverick and Pete Satinsky, also Peter Bartlett and Malcolm Ramey. In addition, I got to see a couple people I've actually only met one other time. James Shackle, who's a TI 99 enthusiast, and I mentioned him earlier as he's been a friend of the show for some time, and Paulo Garcia of Vintage is the New Old. Finally, how could one attend a show without picking up some items? Besides the requisite show-themed t-shirt, I got an Atari 800 XL cover from Paulo Garcia, sewn by his wife, a TRS-80 encyclopedia book from Paulo, and some color pens for my Atari 1020 printer plotter, and also works with some of the Tandy pocket computer printers. And I got those from Jeff Burt at his table. It was a great show as usual, and it sounds like they made enough money from the attendance, tables, donations, and auction to have another show next year. And that's it for new acquisitions and what I've been up to.
This is Dave Needle, tech journalist here in Silicon Valley, and you're listening to the Floppy Days podcast.
Okay, about upcoming shows, this late in the year, there's not much left. But there are a couple shows here I wanted to mention. I know that some of the shows for next year are starting to be announced, and I'll start talking about those next episode. But for the remainder of this year, there are a couple shows I know about. One of them is actually going on this same weekend that I'm recording. It is the Chicago TI International World's Fair, October 29th at the Evanston Public Library in Evanston, Illinois. I was hoping to get there this year. I've never been to this show, but was not able to make it. And finally, the World of Commodore. It finally was announced. It's always the first weekend in December. This year it is December 3rd and 4th. It's in Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. It's actually going to be physical and virtual this year, so you can attend either way. And, hopefully you'll be able to attend one way or the other. And that's it for upcoming shows for 2022. Okay, let's move forward with the main part of the show, an interview with Chris Smith, author of the ZX Spectrum Ula, How to Design a Microcomputer. So I'm here today with Chris Smith. Chris was highly involved with the ZX Spectrums, has done a lot of work there. We're going to find out more about that. But hey, Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm great today. How are you?
I am excellent. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today. Can we start out with maybe you just telling us where you live and what you do today?
Yeah, sure thing. So I live in the UK in South Wales, and what I do for a living is I'm part of the company, one of the directors, in fact, the technical director of Retro Games Limited. And we're behind the modern reincarnation of such old school computers, such as the C64 Mini, the C64 full size, and most recently the A500 Mini, which has got 25 fully licensed Amiga games in that, and the associated accessories and joysticks and things that we produce to go along with those. So I'm still very much involved in the retro scene, doing now as a career what I long to do back in the 80s as a hobby.
Well, that's excellent. I didn't even realize you were involved with that. I have all of those reproductions that you mentioned, the C64 and the Amiga. Those are cool machines. I really enjoy using those. I didn't realize you were involved with that.
Yeah, it's one of those really quiet things that we kind of do in the background, really. But yeah.
Yeah. So when's there going to be a ZX Spectrum reproduction?
Well, it's something that we get asked to do a lot. In fact, or I guess going back about 10 years ago, I was involved in a venture to reproduce the ZX Spectrum and spent some time working with Clive Sinclair and Rick Dickinson, both of whom sadly have recently passed away. And that was a bit of a fun time. So yeah, we've got a bit of technology under our belts with that respect. So yeah, it is something we're going to look at doing in the future for sure.
Yeah, cool. Outstanding. That'd be wonderful. All right. So tell us a little bit about your background with some of these vintage machines. Did you actually grow up with a ZX Spectrum?
I did. It started really back in about, I guess it would have been 1981 that my father took me to the high street newsagents, and I don't know whether this was on a premise of getting some magazine or other, or he wanted me to see the computer that they had there, which was a ZX81, which I guess in the States would have been the Timex TS1000 or Timex 1000. It was mounted on a plastic stand with a black and white television, and there was a guy there with his daughter, and he'd been typing in this program, and I was looking on inquisitively, and he said, "Oh, do you want to have a go?" So the program he'd written said, "Hello, what is your name?" So I typed in Christopher very slowly, and then he told me to press the return key. So I pressed the return key, and it said, "Hello, Christopher, how are you?" Super basic program, but it blew my mind because at that time, I had no experience of computer devices that actually had storage, that could remember what you typed in and give it back to you. I mean, it was a totally new thing, and that was it. I was totally and utterly hooked. So I guess within a year for my birthday, my parents bought me a ZX81, which I think would have been towards the end of 82 rather. And then at the end of 83 is when I got my ZX Spectrum. And that's where my programming and stuff really took off. I was driven to write a game or write some games and have them published, because you'd see all these games being produced, and month on month after that, all of these games got better and better and better. People were pushing the machine to more and more to the limits, and I just found that amazing. And I wanted to be one of those people. So that's how I started, really.
Yeah, neat story. It's such a common story that people remember their first time, seeing a personal computer and interacting with it, and it can tend to drive what they choose as their career and really make a difference in their lives. So it's really, really cool to hear those stories.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I can remember the smell. I can still remember the smell of the box, the pot irons. It's be with me forever, really. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know that you fairly recently produced a book called the ZX Spectrum Ula, How to Design a Microcomputer. Can you tell us about how that came about and what that's all about?
Yes. So when I was doing all this software programming back on the ZX Spectrum, I was also really interested in electronics. I'd been into electronics since I was about 3 years old, very, 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 very early age. And so as well as knowing how to make things happen with the computer by typing in programs and writing software, I also had quite a drive to understand how they worked. So when I typed this computer statement in, how is that actually being translated into electrical pulses and all that kind of stuff? And I was really inspired by some software developers of the day, particularly a guy called Simon Brattle, who worked for it's Crystal Software, then Design up in Manchester. He used to build his own Z80 based computers to develop his next game on, and that was astounding to me. And I guess I would have been 14 years old. So I had this real idea building my own computer. But I was relatively young. Any books on doing such a thing from the library were either really high level, just giving you the concepts, or they were university texts, which I wasn't mature enough or educated enough really at that point to be able to decipher the information in them. So being able to get a picture on a television screen was beyond my my ability and my access to that information at that time. But I tried to sketch out some circuit diagrams and that kind of thing. And then I had some computer games published by a company called Microcomputer. Then I went off to university, and I didn't really go back to it. I got involved with doing stuff with ARM chips and things, but I never really went back to the Spectrum. And then in about 2006, 2007, I was clearing out the attic space of the house, and I found some of those circuit diagrams from, back in 1984, 85, 86, of basically a basic computer I wanted to build. And these circuits were trying to put graphics on the screen. And they weren't complete and they weren't correct, but the ideas, I could see the ideas in these circuits, and the ideas were right. They just weren't fully formed. So I said to myself, well, I've got the benefit of a university education, several years of work experience. Could I do this now? So I thought, well, yeah, let's make my own computer. And one day I just thought, well, if I'm going to do that, why don't I try and recreate the ZX Spectrum using off-the-shelf components? Because it has been done. The machine has been cloned before, but nobody's got it 100% right. So in terms of the timing and stuff, because a lot of as a software developer for the Spectrum back in the day, I was acutely aware that some of the tricks that you needed to exploit to get certain graphical effects on the screen needed an innate knowledge of how the timing worked of the computer. And if that timing was not correct because the clone of the ZX Spectrum wasn't designed accurately, then these software tricks wouldn't work. So I knew how important they were. So I thought, well, that would be a really cool thing to do, because nobody's really uncovered what these timings were and exactly how they worked. We know how they work from monitoring them in software, but what is the circuit inside the ULA? And that was the important part, is the ZX Spectrum built on the chip reduction techniques of the ZX81, and it had a custom chip made by a company called Ferranti, the uncommitted logic array. But by the time it gets into the Spectrum, it is committed. That's just the mix-up in the name. But it basically had a CPU, some ROM, some RAM, some video color encoding circuitry, but everything else at the heart of the computer, the thing that made it different from any other computer that was Z80 based, was this ULA chip, and that basically contained all the logic of the computer. And we couldn't see inside that, of course. So understanding how the Spectrum timing worked and why it worked a particular way, and was it by design or was it by accident, and all that kind of stuff, was unknown to everybody, apart from the original designer, Richard Altbasser. So I embarked on this mission to build my own computer, but as a specification for it, the specification I set myself was the ZX Spectrum, and with an agenda of discovering what all these timing secrets were. And that took several months to do that, and I ended up with a computer called the Harlequin, which some people in the community have turned from my breadboard version. They produced PCBs that fit inside an original ZX Spectrum case, and you can build these things yourself now. And they, because they're not using a ULA, they're using custom chips that are off the shelf. They're not very expensive to make. They run much cooler, so they last much longer. And it's a great fun project if you're into electronics and you want to build your own ZX Spectrum. You can do that. But some of the things that I discovered in reverse engineering the ULA, some of them were guesses. I was pretty sure I was right, but without seeing the exact circuit that's inside the ULA, I'd be guessing. It was a conjecture, and a lot of people were encouraging me to write out what I'd found. It's all published on my website, www.zxdesign.info. You can go through all 68, 69 pages of my analysis and creation of the Harlequin. But I didn't know for sure if some of the decisions I'd made were exactly what's inside the ULA. And I would have felt like a fraud saying, this is how it works, because I didn't know for sure. But I was lucky enough to come across a meetup with somebody who offered to open up a ULA chip and image the silicon under a microscope for me and send me the images, which would have been $5,000 or $6,000 worth of work, really. But they were kind of interested in what it looked like as well, so they did it over Christmas for me when their lab was basically everyone was on holiday for free, and I'm really indebted to Mike Connors at Daytel for doing that for me. And once I had those circuit photographs of the silicone, I then painstakingly spent, I don't know, must have been about a year, a long time, back annotating that entire silicon photograph back into the transistor model of the ULA, and then turned the groups of transistors into logic gates, then turned the logic gates into functional blocks. And then after all that work, I then had a full circuit diagram of the previously unknown circuit of the ZX Spectrum ULA. And then, of course, I had to write the book about it because so much effort had gone into it. It would be a shame if I didn't share that then with the world. So that's how that book came about. So it was a relatively complicated journey from about 2007 to mid 2010. So it was a long effort to get all this working.
I imagine. I mean, it sounds like a tremendous amount of work. And, did you have any help at all from anyone who was originally involved with the design?
So in my investigation and creation of the Harlequin, no, that was purely done on the basis of the deep level of understanding I had of how the ZX Spectrum worked. I got a few things wrong, and people were reading my blog online as I was writing it and pointed out a couple of assumptions I'd made that were incorrect, and they get due credit on the blog for pointing those things out. But in terms of taking the ULA and converting that into the full circuit diagram, which was further complicated by the fact that, unlike FPGAs and CPLD modern gate arrays that we find in equipment these days, the ULA had both digital and analog circuitry inside it. So that was quite tough to work out how some of the analog circuitry worked, especially in generating the video output. But no, I didn't have any help. It was, in that respect, it was it was all just hard slog, really. But before I finished writing the book, I happened to stumble across, completely randomly, a book on digital photography. And the guy who wrote this book on digital photography, I discovered had actually written a book on retro consoles. It was like a photographic coffee table book, basically, of all these retro computers and things, mostly photographs, very little text. And I did notice that he'd credited Richard Altwasser in the back pages and thanked him for some of his help. So I contacted this guy, and he managed to introduce me via email to Richard Altwasser, who designed the ZX Spectrum. And we corresponded a little bit over email. And he lives in Portishead, which is literally across the Bristol Channel from where I live. And he has a little yacht. So he sailed across one day with his wife, and while he was on his way over, gave me a phone call and said, "How far are you away from this marina, and I'm literally 4 miles away. So we met for dinner and chatted about how the ZX Spectrum worked, and I got a tremendous amount of anecdotal information and stories from when it was, when he was working at Sinclair and developing the ZX81 and the Spectrum, and that all went in the book, and it turned the book from a very what might have been otherwise been quite a dry technical treatment of the product into something that was very much more human and had much more of a story with it. So I was really thankful for Richard for giving me that information. It was it was all stuff that people didn't know, particularly, and I'd love to share this with you right now. It's these chips are manufactured in clean rooms, of course, because you can't have any dust. And when they first developed this ULA, and Richard got the first ever prototype chip to test, it didn't work. In fact, the engineer at Ferranti had forgotten to connect 2 points on the chip inside on the silicon, so it didn't work. But amazingly, so these chips are made on like a 12-inch diameter, also round wafer. And so you get like 30 or 40 chips on this one wafer. One of those chips on the wafer, despite the fact it was made in a clean room, a speck of dust had landed on this chip, on the photographic mask that was on the chip, and bridged the points where there was actually a missing connection. And when they manufactured it, that piece of dust would have ordinarily, of course, that one chip to fail, but it ironically caused that one chip to
work.
All the others.
That's funny.
So Richard was able to test the chip, that one chip, and prove that it worked. And then the engineer fixed the missing connection, and everything was fine. But nobody knew that story until Richard told me it, and it's unbelievable, but it is in fact true.
That's amazing. I mean, what are the chances that it would fall? A piece of dust would fall, right into the right spot to make that happen. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing that you got to talk with Richard and get those stories and get his take on things. That had to be pretty incredible.
It was amazing. It was. It kind of gave the work I was doing some credibility, I felt. It was almost, by him reaching out and saying, let's chat about this, it was almost giving me permission to tell his story as well, from a technical point. But he's quite a quiet man, It's for him it was a job, and he moved on to the next project, and then moved on to the next project, and that kind of thing. As I guess we often all do, with work. But for many of us, the what he created in the ZX Spectrum holds a real special place in our hearts. So it's it was great. It's great to hear those stories and things, and it was nice for me to tell that human side of the ZX Spectrum along intertwined with the technical side. It kind of brings it down to earth, really.
It's amazing, too, how when you talk with someone like that, how much they actually remember, about what they did. We're talking 40 years ago now, and it's pretty incredible that, that he remembers that much about it. It must have been a pretty important part of his life.
Yeah, I think so. He was straight out of university, and he finished off. In fact, he got the ZX81 to work, the prototype to work, whilst I'm forgetting the other engineer's name now. It slipped my mind. While that chap was on holiday, and because of doing that, he impressed the senior technical people at Sinclair, and that's how he got to get the ZX Spectrum gig, I guess. So it was his first solo project. So I guess that's kind of sticks in your mind as well. So it's good for me, in fact, that it was one of his first projects, because I guess that's why it stuck in his mind so acutely, and he could share that information with me then, So
Sure. So, great job all around on this. I mean, that had to be sounds like a pretty incredible project. How's the book been received? Have you gotten a lot of feedback on it?
It's an interesting question to answer, because I only expected to sell a small volume, really. I knew it would be of interest to a lot of people, but that isn't a lot of people, because it's quite a niche thing. I spent some time thinking about the book title. It is, the ZX Spectrum Ula, but when I was about midway through writing the book, I wanted it to be the book that I needed as a 14-year-old boy. I mean, that was one of my writing goals, really. If this book had been available when I was 14, then when I was 14, 15, 16, maybe I could have created my own computer. So I've deliberately made each chapter. You need to have a little bit of electronics knowledge and understand how logic works, but you don't need to be an electronic engineer in that sense. The chapters tend to get more and more technical as you get through them. So you can when it gets too deep for you, you can bail and move on to the next chapter, and you can, as your experience improves, you can read the book again and get more out of it. So I was quite careful with the title of the book. So I've called it the ZX Spectrum Ula, but it was evident when I was about 2/3 of the way through writing it that actually this book was more about how computers in the 80s were designed, and it was using the ZX Spectrum Ula as a case study. That's kind of how it ended up coming out, really, in terms of the way it was written. And that's why I gave it that subtitle of How to Design a Microcomputer, which I have since heard in reviews and things that it was that title that drew people to the book in the first place, particularly a lot of people in the States who wouldn't really know much about the ZX Spectrum. They might know about the Timex machines, which were a derivative of the Spectrum, but the Spectrum itself wasn't for sale in the US because it completely did not meet the FCC emission regulations at all. So I've had a lot of readers from the States who have found my book and written great reviews on Amazon and stuff about it. And they found it on the basis of the fact it was, how to design a microcomputer. So it's reached a bigger audience through that than I would have expected it to. And it's also reached an audience of people who didn't really know what the ZX Spectrum was. And they've since become enthusiasts of it, which is, after 30, 40 years, is quite a surprise to there being a new audience for such machines. So the book's been really well received by both electronic engineers and people who have just got a passing knowledge of electronics, but a keen interest in understanding how the computer of their childhood actually worked. So, I'm really, really pleased with it. It hasn't allowed me to buy a yacht. It hasn't sold in great numbers. It's not it hasn't been a bestseller.
Well, the good thing about it too is it doesn't ever get out of date, right? Because what you're talking about is talking about a historical computer, so it's always going to be accurate. It's not going to ever fade away like most technical books do.
Exactly, and that is I've done a little bit of lecturing for the British Computer Society and some other organisations around the work I've done on the ZX Spectrum, but particularly from a digital archaeology point of view, because what may be obvious when you say it, but probably isn't obvious until you think about it or say it, is that, and we touched upon this when we were just talking about Richard Altwasser and the fact he still remembers what he did, even though he's produced many, many, many machines and digital electronic designs and things, is that back in the 80s, these companies would produce these computers and they would make innovations in them, and they would build on those innovations from computer to computer to computer. but those innovations and the significance of those innovations weren't really documented at the time. I mean, they didn't keep the circuit diagrams for the Spectrum because it wasn't deemed important. But now when we look back and we want to trace back the origins of, say, the Intel processor and, the Pentium or the, the modern processor and sort of track them back as to where the innovations first started, as you go back in time, the trail goes cold because the documentation trail ends because they didn't keep records. So the work I've done in uncovering the internals of the ULA is important in that. Well, I've since discovered it, and it's been reflected back to me. Is important because it fills in a massive gap in that archaeological record, really, where this stuff wasn't documented. I mean, Ferranti produced a lot of custom chips for people, all based on their ULA design. But then they went out of business. They didn't pursue the CMOS gate technology. They thought it was a dead end, but it turned out not to be. It turned out to be the next big thing. So they lost their lead in the market and ultimately went out of business, unfortunately, which is often the case. And most of their records, apart from their marketing material, has been destroyed. So the work I've done has helped fill in some of the gaps in the history of the Ferranti Corporation as well. So, yeah, but it's an area I hadn't even considered when I wrote the book.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, again, fantastic work. If somebody wanted to buy it, what's the best avenue for getting your book?
Online bookstores, Amazon, or anyway. I mean, you can even order it in your high street bookstore. They can they probably won't have it in stock, but they can order it, or you can order it from directly from my website. But generally, you'll get it much quicker if you would just go and buy it on Amazon or something like that. It sells enough, I think, for them to keep it, for them to have it in stock. So you usually can get it for the next day if you were that keen to get it. So
I think is there not also a digital version if you want to buy like the Kindle version?
So I didn't do a digital version. I imagine that somebody will have scanned it and uploaded it somewhere on the internet, because that invariably happens with all books. I didn't produce a Kindle version of it. I'd set myself the goal of maybe producing one in the future, but whilst the paperback book was selling, I felt that the sort of people who would buy my book are technically equipped people, and so if I did a digital version, they would be exactly the sort of people who could make that freely available for everybody, and then therefore I wouldn't get any money for writing the book, because the book did cost me to make. It was 3 years of research, and I had to buy equipment, and and it was a lot of time out of my life as well. So there were actual tangible costs to recoup. Well,
I hope you're able to recover at least part of all that hard work you put into it, because that's fantastic work. Any other books on that you've thought about doing similar to this, or for the vintage computer community?
Well, it took me a few years to get over writing that book because it was intense. Yes, there are lots of little chips out there and processors and things that would make really great, candidates to be written about. It's the time around it, really. That's the thing. I'm passionate about writing and documentation and that side of technology. I'm so busy with all the retro gaming stuff that I'm doing at the moment with that company venture that there's a lot of work in understanding how these machines work in order to reproduce them in a modern form, that I haven't really got the time to be writing a book about it. There are a few processors out there that I think could do with a full treatment as a book. not just how they work, but how they work at the gate level, that kind of thing, and the tricks and the magic that they employed within them to get them to do what they did. Because again, these things were all innovative back in the day, and were was basically the scaffold on top of which the processors we've all got in our laptops now and things were based. So they would be brilliant to have a look at. It's the time, and it's the time, because time is money.
Okay. Do you I know you mentioned your interaction with Richard Altwasser, but did you get a chance to see or meet any of the other Spectrum designers, or Clive Sinclair, or anybody like that?
I did, yes. So back in the early 2012, 2013, I got to meet and do a little bit of work with Clive Sinclair.
Awesome.
Who it was a very eccentric character. I'd say not difficult to get along with, but he had his ways about him, but a nice chap, and so it was really nice to have met him and sort of like come sort of full circle. And then later that same year, I think that would have been 82. Yeah, it was the Spectrum 30 event. It was set up in Cambridge. It was in the is it East Anglia University or Anglican University? I think, which is actually based in one of the premises that Sinclair Research used to occupy, partly. And they were doing a panel. They wanted to do a panel talk about the ZX Spectrum design and how it was created, and just for the audience to throw out questions and have them answered. And Richard Altwasser couldn't attend, so I ended up being substituted in as a last-minute replacement. So I sat alongside Rick Dickinson, who was the industrial designer of all of Sinclair's products, so that the whole look and feel and styling of everything from the actual physical unit to the packaging and the case and the peripherals and the manual and everything was all done by Rick Dickinson. So I got to participate in this panel talk as the technical expert of the Spectrum, alongside Rick Dickinson as the industrial design expert of the ZX Spectrum.
Wow!
And that was amazing. Rick and I got on fabulously, and stayed in touch after that, and corresponded on loads of different design type stuff, and then sadly he passed away 3 years ago now, which was a surprise and a shock, really. But he was a lovely man, and it was a privilege to know him, actually.
Well, I think just the fact that you were invited to do that and were part of that really is a testament to the technical knowledge that you have. That had to be a pretty incredible experience. Pretty neat. It was, and getting to meet Clive. I mean, he's one of those larger than life characters. It seems like that it would have been pretty neat to be able to meet him.
It was one of those. It's just one of those really surreal things, because I guess he wasn't really in the public eye. I mean, he was Sir Clive Sinclair and that kind of stuff, but he bowed out of the computer market in '86, and he did his C5 and that kind of stuff. And he was often in the press, but he wasn't really. He was quite a quiet man, really, I guess, in that sense. So I, for one, formed my own ideas of who he was and what he sounded like and how he talked and what his interests would be. And if I met him, the conversations we would have. And of course, when you meet somebody who you kind of idolized in that sense, it's always completely different. So it's really easy to be disappointed, but that's no mark on the man. That's just the way that a young person's brain works, when
right. You have this mental image, right? Of
yeah, exactly. And they never meet. They never marry up. But he was lovely. He was just he was very eccentric, and I think that's to be expected. And It's widely reported, but having it reported and experiencing the man in that sense is a different things really. But it was he was great fun. He was really, really great fun. It's I got to go to visit him at his flat a handful of times. So it was he was all right.
I'm sure that's something you'll never forget. So, Chris, I'm curious, how many Spectrums and other vintage computers do you actually have in your home today?
I've got a bunch of, I think, 3 or 4, 5 broken issue 2 ZX Spectrums that a friend donated to me, which they're still in the box. He donated them to me. But apart from those, I still have my original ZX Spectrum that I got bought in 1983. I don't think it works. I've got a couple of other ZX Spectrums, all rubber key versions, which I've bought on eBay because as part of the book research, I needed to get as many different versions of the ULA possible so I could compare their electrical operation, basically timings and all that kind of stuff, because they did make changes through through the years, through different revisions of the chip. And I'd only analyzed one chip fully, so I needed comparison candidates so I could see what the different models were. I've got a mid-production run issue 1 ZX Spectrum, which I probably paid over the odds for on eBay. But they were the sort of machines, because they either made 16,000 of them or they made 60,000 of them. And the ZX Spectrum sold several million. So, that first production run wasn't that big. And when they did appear on eBay, people would snap them up. So I did bid over the odds for this one. But in order to complete certain sections of the book, I needed to have an issue 1 ULA. So I have that machine, which is in beautiful condition. Not only is it in the original box it came in, that box is in the original packaging that Sinclair posted it out to the person who bought it. So it's in really great nick, that computer. I've got I've got Spectrum Plus. That was the sprung key version. It was the keyboard that was based on. It came after the Sinclair QL. But it uses basically the same key mechanics as the QL, I guess. I guess they'd invested an awful lot of money in that tooling, and so they wanted to, or Sinclair that is, I'm saying Sinclair wanted to capitalize on that investment and get more of a return on it, because they wouldn't have been cheap to shell out for that tooling. So I got one of those computers, and I got a Sinclair QL, which I've only ever used once. But again, I bought that on eBay to complete my collection. I've got some micro drives, an Interface 2, and I've got a Miles Gordon Technology 3.5-inch floppy disk, which was invaluable. It was much better than the micro drive because it was more reliable, and you could seek to programs on it much faster, and it stored more on the floppy disk. So that was a third-party peripheral I bought. So, yeah, I think that's probably my Spectrum collection, really. Probably got 4 or 5 Spectrums, a QL, it's not a Spectrum, obviously, and a bunch of peripherals. And I think that's about it, really.
Is that it? So you don't have any? Do you have any other microcomputers?
Oh gosh, so I've got a VIC-20.
Oh.
Which I inherited from I know not where. I just ended up with a VIC-20.
Just showed up, huh?
Well, I'd had that VIC-20 actually, because it was it's a VIC-20 that's got the same, because they were made. I know this is a talk about the Spectrums, about the ZX Spectrum, but they were made in the US, the VIC-20s and the Commodore 64s. They were also made in Germany. and some other places. The molds for the case weren't always exactly the same, so there's a little bit of variance in the height of these cases. So the VIC-20 I've got is the typical European bread bin size case that they use for the Commodore 64 as well. So it was that case that I used to that I copied basically to make the C64 Mini. So it's the C64
Oh,
Mini.
okay.
It's my VIC-20 basically. But you put it side by side, my friend's Commodore 64 that was bought in the UK, and it's identical. The thing that changes the most is the plastic color. It's a kind of creamy color on the VIC-20.
Right.
It's a more beigey brown or grey, or it depends, where you bought your 64. So I have one of those. Is it red? I suppose it is. I've got an Acorn Archimedes A300, which is the computer I moved to after my Spectrum in about 1988, 89. It's an ARM2. It's the first production ARM chip, and it's got the original IOC VID-C and MEMC chipset, which apparently is quite sought after now, because that is the origins of the processor that's in every phone these days, and Apple products and things. So I have one of those, and it still works. And I am very fond of it, though I don't plug it in very often, because it's got my master's dissertation on it, and I don't want to lose the electronic copy of that, so I've not been plugging it in. I do need to get to do that and extract my master's dissertation.
Yeah, right. Before it's gone.
I use it forever. And I think that's it really for retro stuff. I've got a PlayStation 1. I guess that's retro. But not from, what I would, my retro is a ZX81, which I have one of, my Spectrum collection, and I guess the Acorn Archimedes, the original Acorn Archimedes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's retro.
Nice. That sounds like a pretty nice collection you've got there. Okay. Well, that's really, as far as an interview goes, that's kind of what I wanted to cover with you. Is there anything you want to add there before we move on to the tech specs?
No, I'm just acutely aware that I've given you some quite long answers there, really.
Oh, no, that's great. That's great. No problem.
Yeah, it's just you're asking me things about stuff that I have an awful lot of detail about, and it's like, where do I draw the line, really? So,
right. Oh no, this is great. People enjoy some of the detail that you have given here, so it's very much appreciated.
As long as I haven't made Clive Sinclair sound like he was a Looney Tunes or something.
No, I don't think.
He was totally lovely, but he was just really eccentric. He just had some really weird quirks, and it's. I've not spoken about him for such a long time, or spoken of him for such a long time that my mouth's going before my brain's kicking in.
Well, I can tell you that most of the people, at least here in the U.S., have no idea what Clive was actually like. So, any insight there is definitely appreciated. He's certainly well known here, even though, a lot of the machines, other than Timex Sinclair 1000, were not that popular here in the U.S., but his name is certainly well known.
Well, if you ever see Micro Men, you must, if you've seen that.
Yeah.
Alexander Armstrong. It's a parody of Clive Sinclair, but there's an awful. He is like that, or was like that. So it's not far off. But when I met him, he was in his 80s, so he was very much less animated,
more subdued. I imagine. Very
much more subdued. He was very much more contemplative. Yeah, very, very, very assessing of you and what you're talking about before he answered anything, that kind of stuff. And it was, which was a little bit unnerving. You felt like you were being judged, but it's just his way. And he gave us all the things he gave us, so good on him.
Okay, that's it for this episode for October 2022. I want to give out special thanks to Chris Smith for taking time to talk with me today. Chris has a very interesting background, and I hope you all enjoyed the interview. I provided links in the show notes for all the great websites we discuss during the podcast. Go to floppydays.com to get that list. Also, please provide feedback for the show. I really do enjoy getting feedback, and you can do that at iTunes or on the website, via email at floppydays@gmail.com, via Twitter at floppydays, or on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/floppydays. Floppy Days is available for streaming at Stitcher.com and now also on Spotify as well. Until the next show, pull out a vintage computer and compute as if it were yesterday. Bye.